reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this, the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has arisen in our midst, and God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and in all the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord. A couple of weeks ago, I came upon an amazing story of an Australian mountain climber. His name was Lincoln Hall, and his story takes place on Mount Everest in May of 2006. And at that time, he was part of a climbing expedition that was planning to climb to the summit of Mount Everest. So they made their preparations, and they paid the people that they knew they needed to help them, and they set out on their journey. And on May 25th, 2006, they reached the summit of Mount Everest. But as soon as they began to descend back down, Lincoln Hall got a serious problem. He developed a condition that's called acute altitude sickness. And what happens is sometimes the brain, in response to high altitude, begins to fill with fluid and it swells. And the person who has it can become very confused, and they can even hallucinate. And Lincoln Hall got so bad that he was unable to descend back down the mountain. If anything, the descent is more difficult than going up. And for hours, the others in the group tried to get him to wake up so that he could get back down to the base camp. But at about 5 or 6 o'clock, the sun began to go down, and their supply of oxygen began to dwindle, and it began to snow. And Lincoln Hall got so bad that he became unresponsive, and they couldn't rouse him at all. And so they radioed down to the base camp, and the base camp called back and said, "He's gone. You've got to leave him there, or else you will be in danger yourselves." So very sadly, they left Lincoln Hall up on the mountain, and they descended and returned to the base camp. And then they had to put in that terrible phone call to his wife in Australia to tell her that he had not survived the climb. Now, Mount Everest in May is a pretty busy place because that's the only month that the weather will allow people to try to climb to the summit. And so the following day, the final expedition of the season began to mount from the base camp and began to ascend the mountain. And they were led by an American. His name was Daniel Mazur. And the day seemed like a perfect day for climbing. There was no snow, there was no wind, the temperature was ideal, and it looked like they would get to the summit pretty easily. But then when they got to about 28,000 feet and they rounded a bend on the trail, they got the surprise of their lives, for sitting right next to the trail with his legs crossed, looking over a cliff, was Lincoln Hall. He had his jacket wrapped around his waist. He didn't have any gloves on. He didn't have a hat on. And he looked at them and he said, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." They were surprised to see him. They probably thought they were seeing a ghost. But after that shock, very quickly, Daniel Mazer and the others in the group decided that despite all their preparation, all their planning, all their expense, they had to put down $25,000 a person to be able to make this climb. Despite all that, they couldn't go on. They had to stay there and help Lincoln Hall. Now he was alive, but he was very confused, and so the first thing they had to do was pull him away from the cliff so he wouldn't accidentally go over the cliff. And they put his coat on right, and they put a hat on, and they put 2 gloves on him, and they gave him oxygen, and they even gave him chocolate to eat to raise his blood sugar. And he began to wake up and to become oriented again. And so, with the help of a couple of Sherpa guides, they were able to very slowly and gradually get him back down to the base camp. And he called his wife. So if you can imagine what was going through her mind the day before she had been called and told that he was deceased. And now he himself was calling her to say, "No, I'm still here. I'm alive." And the doctors down the base camp examined him, and he had severe frostbite of his hands, and he ended up losing his fingertips. But otherwise, he was okay. And appropriately enough, he was featured on an episode of the TV documentary, I Shouldn't Be Alive. And afterward, he made a number of trips to the Himalaya mountains and even founded a charitable organization to help the Himalayan people. But he never again tried to climb Mount Everest. He knew how badly his wife and his 2 sons needed him and how bad he needed them. And he didn't want to take a chance on losing them. He felt that he had lost his fingertips on the mountain that day, but at the same time, he found his priorities. Now in today's gospel, we hear that Christ and his followers enter the city of Nain, just as the people there are carrying out the body of a young man who's died, and he was the only son of a widow. And now she's left all alone. And Christ feels such compassion for her that he halts the funeral procession. And he tells the young man, "Arise." And the young man gets up. And Christ gives him back to his mother. And the men and women of Nain are astounded. And they say, God has visited his people. And so today's gospel tells us of the power of Christ and the compassion of Christ, true God and true man. But there's something else. We see his compassion is not so much toward the man who died, but for his mother. And he gives to her not a sum of gold, not a pile of coins. He gives to her her son back, and that son becomes the instrument of the compassion and the power of Christ. And so if we ask, where do we see ourselves in this story? We can think of that young man, and we can think of Lincoln Hall. When he seemingly returned from the dead, he saw his destiny to be the instrument of love and compassion and comfort to his wife and his 2 sons. And so, in the image of that young man who rises from the dead, we arise each morning at the call of Christ, and then we go forth, and we are the instrument of the love and the compassion of Christ to all those we meet today. And like Daniel Mazer and his companions, who became a part of the awakening of Lincoln Hall to the joys and the wonders of this life, Christ invites us to become, through our words, our prayers, and our deeds, a part of His plan to awaken the whole world to the joys and the wonders of eternal life.